The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure for me to rise in this House and speak on the issue or issues related to veterans. And I'm very happy to follow my colleague from Saint-Jean in his remarks tonight, in particular because we share an affinity for Collège Militaire Royal and his riding. We both reminded this House not long ago of the '94 budget from the Liberals, really, that kick-started the decade of darkness for the Canadian Forces, which closed that fine school. And I was very proud that our government a number of years ago reopened Collège Militaire Royal in Saint-Jean, and that my friend Michel Maisonneuve has done a great job building that Centre of Excellence back up, and we hope to see it continue to help produce fine young men and women leaders for the Canadian Forces. And speaking of leadership, we're talking today on Bill C-27 and the subject of the Veteran Hiring Act. And it's important for Canadians that may be listening to this debate or groups that are unsure about the subject to know that this is truly a group effort. A few members of this House suggested, well, there's not going to be many veterans that would qualify for the public service, or, you know, it's going to be a very small group or contingent. That might be true. This might be only for dozens or over many years, 100 or 200 serving veterans to transition into other public sector positions. But it's an example, Mr. Speaker, of our government playing an active role in the subject of hiring veterans, and more importantly, Mr. Speaker, creating a culture in Canada where hiring a veteran becomes commonplace. And I would suggest that doesn't exist at the moment, but there's a number of groups that I'll refer to in my remarks that over the last 5 to 10 years have been trying to create a culture of hiring a veteran in Canada, Mr. Speaker. Why is that a good culture to build? Well, I suggest altruistically it's good to hire a veteran. These are men and women that served our country with distinction, at times putting themselves into harm's way, whether overseas in Afghanistan or admissions here in Canada. And so it's good for the government and indeed the private sector to hire veterans. But it's more than just altruism, Mr. Speaker. It's good business sense. It's actually accretive, to use a business term, to the bottom line, because you're getting men and women with demonstrated leadership, whether it's a master corporal or a major general. These Canadians have received training that is unparalleled throughout NATO and throughout the developed world in terms of an educated military and one that is trained in leadership ethics, trained in managing people, trained at leading under stressful situations, Mr. Speaker, and with a culture that is inherently loyal. The regimental structure that the military is based upon is based on loyalty. So in a day and age, and I've dealt with employers for many years, and one of their biggest challenges is actually retention. And if somebody's highly in demand, they'll go on to the next opportunity. Well, hiring a veteran actually helps reduce your costs over time by retaining people because they're inherently loyal. And if you show loyalty to them with the opportunity of a job, they will return it and not just meet your expectations but exceed them. So the government is an important partner in the creation of a culture in Canada to hire a veteran. And I'm pleased to be part of a government that's brought 2 bills before this House, Mr. Speaker, on this very subject. And whether they hire 1,000 people or 1 person, it's a good step for Canada. C-11 was a priority hiring for injured veterans who release as a result of injury. And C-27, here before us today, Mr. Speaker, is on veteran hiring for the public service more broadly. What this bill stems to do is it looks at Canadian Forces members who've served at least 3 years of service and allows them that internal hiring operation or opportunity in another part of government. And it's important to think for a moment, Mr. Speaker. Whenever I speak on veterans, I try and bring facts and try and educate others on this, because there's too much rhetoric on this subject and not enough facts. So it might be new to some people in this House to learn that upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 people transition from the Canadian Forces each year, with about 1,200 of those people leaving for a variety of medical reasons, whether it's a serious injury as a result of service like in Afghanistan, or whether it's someone whose vision or hearing has become impaired and they may lose their flight qualification, like I almost did in the Air Force when my hearing was damaged. So people will be transitioning, and we're looking at 4,000 to 5,000 men and women transitioning out of uniform each year. And this bill will give those people one more avenue to explore as they plan their transition out of uniform, Mr. Speaker. So for someone that received an honourable release from the Canadian Forces after that 3-year service minimum, they will have a level of priority within the hiring, within the civil service. And that extends out now to 5 years, Mr. Speaker. Why is that number important? Because it inherently recognizes that when you transition, a veteran may go back and receive additional training or may get more education. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? The Canadian Forces can assist with that. And in fact, there's matching of some payments for training programs and tuition payments to allow people to continue their education while in uniform. And in many cases, there's such tuition assistance as they transition out. So by building in a 5-year period, we're acknowledging that the person may release and may decide to improve their skills or education, and we want to make sure that opportunity in the civil service remains open to them. And as I said with respect to C-11 earlier, Mr. Speaker, if someone releases from the Canadian Forces as a result of a medical release, so an injury or a change in their medical categories, they will be given the highest priority of hiring within the civil service. And I think that is appropriate. It recognizes that the men and women that join the Canadian Forces give an unlimited liability to their country. And the members of this place, the most important decision we make as parliamentarians is when we make a decision to send our men and women into harm's way. And so it's appropriate for us in turn to give these people the highest priority to find a position in the civil service. So I'm glad to hear that many members of this House on all sides are here to support C-27, the Veteran Hiring Act. I'm disappointed because it's certainly clear by listening to the debate, Mr. Speaker, that not a lot is known about the subject and how many people transition each year, and unfortunately the politics in this area creeps in so often. But it's refreshing to see that in principle most members of this House will be supporting C-27. So I want to take another few minutes of my time to talk about what I alluded to at the outset, which is building a culture of hiring a veteran in Canada. And I said with C-27 and with Bill C-11, our government has been an important partner, and in many ways we've helped nudge the private sector and other individuals in Canada into doing more for hiring our veterans. But I also want, as a parliamentarian that served in the Canadian Forces for 12 years, and after my release worked on veterans issues for the last decade, I want to salute some of the Canadians who've been doing this in a steadfast and dedicated way over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, because government should not be the answer for everyone. Veterans, a lot of veterans, will want to go into the private sector. So there's been some real trailblazers in that regard. In fact, another thing our government did, Mr. Speaker, was create the Veterans Transition Advisory Council. And I'm very happy to say the minister just last Friday met with the Veterans Transition Advisory Council, VTAC, as it's called, in Toronto, to hear their latest update. This is a group of business leaders from across the country that the previous minister gave a mandate to help break down barriers within certain industry sectors and help report back to the government on how we can help facilitate more hiring of veterans. In a similar way to helmets and hard hats help break that into the construction industry, the VTAC was meant to do that. And I'd like to thank Sean Francis in this House, Mr. Speaker, the chair of the True Patriot Love Foundation, who was the first chair of VTAC, and as well the vice chair, Joel Watson, someone that I'm happy to call a very good friend like Sean. Joel served as a dragoon officer before becoming a lawyer in Toronto and has continually given back. And the entire board of the Veterans Transition Advisory Council, which has been advising this government, each have started veteran-friendly hiring initiatives within their own company. And in some cases, that might mean dealing with the Human Resources Department to educate them, to let them know that hiring a veteran and looking at military experience as an important determinant on who to hire is something that they should really focus on. And in fact, one of my last major initiatives as one of the founders of the True Patriot Love Foundation, Mr. Speaker, was working on a conference with Canadian employers called From Battlefields to Boardrooms, where the goal was actually to bring senior human resources leaders from companies across Canada to a conference to hear from veterans, to hear from other companies that are hiring veterans, to show them that sometimes accommodating a veteran in the hiring process or considering their military service to be on par or equal to some related civilian experience will go a long way in getting them someone that is really a great addition to their team. And that conference also had leaders from the Canadian Forces educating private sector employers on what the difference is between a corporal and a colonel. Because a lot of civilian organizations that don't have veterans within them may not know the different types of service, the different types of education and training that our men and women in the Canadian Forces had. So the Battlefields to Boardrooms conference was a big step in breaking down barriers to hiring veterans. And I'd like to thank all the participants in that event, Mr. Speaker. There's also groups that have been doing this as part of their outreach to Canadians in working with veterans and working with our wounded. And I spent time just this Saturday with Scott Maxwell and Phil Ralph from Wounded Warriors Canada, Mr. Speaker, in Uxbridge, at a fantastic thank you to our troops tribute. And Wounded Warriors, as part of their charitable efforts, allowing Canadians to support the men and women of the Canadian Forces, they've encountered companies and employers that want to do more than just help financially. They want to open their hiring process and open opportunities within their companies to veterans. So I salute the entire team at Wounded Warriors, and I know they have an upcoming employer summit or employer fair in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, where they'll be spreading their message that it's more than just the right thing to do. It will be some of the best hiring decisions you'll make by hiring men and women who've served Canada. Probably the most fascinating group I've ever encountered, and I'm happy to belong to it as well, Mr. Speaker, is a group called Treble Victor. Began a few years ago by Don Ludlow and Mark Walden, currently led by Tim Patrickin. This is a networking group that started in Toronto of veterans. And what they do after they've transitioned into the private sector is they meet with their HR department, they meet with their senior leadership and ask them the question, why aren't we hiring more veterans? Or are there barriers to the hiring of veterans in our company that we can address? And they've had tremendous success, Mr. Speaker. I remember a number of years ago, before joining this House, Gord Nixon, the CEO of Royal Bank, talked about, when approached by Treble Victor members within his company or within the bank, actually doing a bit of an audit. How many veterans do we have here? And he was amazed at how many there were within the national organization. They were then empowered to create a network within the bank and to help other veterans find employment. Canada Company, Mr. Speaker, another spectacular example of good charitable work leading to employment opportunities for veterans. Started by Blake Goldring and a number of prominent business leaders, Mr. Speaker, and I've been happy to attend a lot of their events in my time when I was a lawyer in Toronto. It started as a program to raise funds for scholarships for the children of the fallen. But soon, that grew into an employment initiative as senior business leaders also wanted to do more than just support financially. So they have the Military Employment Transition Program, the MET program, and a website of tools run by an RMC classmate of mine, Walter Moniz, reaching out to employers and actually allowing a transitioning veteran to plug into an opportunity in the private sector. There's also groups like Military Minds, started by a soldier suffering from operational stress injuries, creating a community for people to rally upon. Now there's opportunities for employment from that. When I was in Windsor, Mr. Speaker, I met with the leaders of Delta Company, a group of business leaders from the Windsor area helping find employment for members of the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment. So, government is one part of building a culture here in Canada of hiring a veteran. And I wanted to salute some of the trailblazers, some of the people that really have been at the vanguard of this subject. I'd also like the opportunity to thank a couple of members of this House, and in fact, the members from the other side of this House, Mr. Speaker. My friends from Abitibi-Témiscamingue and Winnipeg North, who last week joined me in co-hosting the second annual celebration of service on the Hill, recognizing the parliamentarians and members of Parliament Hill staff who have served in uniform. At the event this year, we also recognized some of the trailblazing companies that have been doing great hiring veteran programs for many years. General Electric, McDonald's, Thales, and TD Bank. The award for TD Bank was received by retired General Rick Hillier, Mr. Speaker, who now works at TD Bank and also helped them roll out a veteran hiring program throughout their national network of branches. McDonald's, Mr. Speaker, they started as a charitable sponsor of the True Patriot Love Dinner and now have hired veterans throughout their organization. And that's an organization where you can start small and go all the way to the top organically. So we wanted to recognize on Parliament Hill some of these trailblazers. And quickly, Mr. Speaker, I've heard concern here about Veterans Affairs ads. And I'll tell you, if any member of this House has actually worked on this issue like I have for the last decade, the most important part of those ads, and the information is very important because most young veterans from Afghanistan, they try and access most of their services online. There's 15,000 have signed up for MyVac account. But more importantly is the image. The soldier, former soldier, straightening his tie, taking his daughter's hand, going out of the house. Mr. Speaker, that's been a message and an image I've been trying personally to send for many years to show that taking the uniform off, our veterans are the men and women of Canada. They're dads. They transition into amazing soccer coaches and parent council members and private sector employees. So even more important than the valuable information on service and how to contact it is sending the message that you can transition from uniform, and we're thankful for that service, and have a meaningful post-military career and be a great dad, a great community member, a great role model. And Mr. Speaker, websites which have been mocked by some in this House, I would suggest is the #1 way anybody thinking of transitioning out of the forces finds out about it. They go to Google, Mr. Speaker, and they Google it. And the employers and the businesses and the charities that have worked on this for 10 years, Mr. Speaker, we're all there. It seems the MPs in this House seem to forget that we now not only serve veterans that are 80 and 90, we serve Afghan veterans with multiple tours in their 20s. So we have to be doing ads. We have to be online. And I'd invite members to look at the journalist Kevin Newman's blog on the subject. We need a better and more unified website that scores highly and that people will see. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can finish by saying it will take government and the private sector to build this hire a veteran culture. We have to show that it's not only the right thing to do, but hiring a veteran will make your business a better place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Brome-Missisquoi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, je voudrais d'abord remercier mon collègue pour son discours et j'aimerais lui demander, au-delà des paroles et des discours pieux, est-ce que le gouvernement conservateur va reconnaître enfin l'existence du devoir sacré envers nos anciens combattants blessés? Merci, Monsieur le Président.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad the member asked that question because it allows me to speak for a moment on my favorite Prime Minister. I love history, is Robert Borden. And Robert Borden, when he went to conferences in London during the war, he visited our wounded on the front. And he said that it is a duty for Canada to take care of our injured. And if you see with what was the act in 1925 that began the Legion, and eventually, decades later, Veterans Affairs, the government has committed to supporting and helping our veterans. But it's never remained static, Mr. Speaker. It's always changed. And I'll use an example of why. The MP for my riding in World War I served at Vimy. He was elected to Parliament from the fronts in 1917. But he died sadly as a result of his post-traumatic stress disorder. He's not even discussed. Most Canadians don't know he exists. Sam Sharp is his name. So now our government is evolving. We've opened 17 operational stress injury clinics. Mr. Speaker, it's more about a phrase or a term. It's about a commitment. And if you look at $700 million on an operational basis in more funding each year, and a cumulative total of $4.5 billion in benefits, our commitment is clear, but we're also not going to be stuck in the past. We're going to evolve to meet the future needs of our veterans.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member from Durham for his service to our country and for his comments. And I frankly agree with his idea of creating a culture of hiring a veteran. I don't entirely agree with the touting of which he did of his own government and everything they have done, because you're going to hear, and you have heard already, that you could be doing much more in a more significant way. Through you, Mr. Speaker. We talked about helmets to hard hats earlier, and we know how much of a failure that program was, $100,000 and hired very, very few veterans. There's an opportunity. I'm trying to be constructive. There's an opportunity here for the government to be more engaged in this process by using what they call a skills translator. They're using it in the United States, Mr. Speaker, for a quarter of the price that this government is spending on ads for veterans during the playoffs. A quarter of the price. It will align, it will translate and interpret the skills of any of our veterans, translate those skills into other jobs that are out there. They link veterans in the United States with the private sector, not just the public sector. Very minimal cost. I'm wondering if the member, and I challenge the member through you, Mr. Speaker, to take this idea to his caucus, to his veterans minister, and encourage him for a very little cost to embrace this idea of skills translators to help our veterans more significantly determine their aptitudes and find employment.
Well, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member from Guelph touched a subject that I've also worked on for many years. In fact, long before I joined this Parliament in 2012, I've met with the folks from Monster many times, in fact, over the years, and know and have seen their skills translator. And in fact, they're coming to my office in the next few weeks to show me the modifications to that translator. Part of the challenge, Mr. Speaker, and I'd commend the member for bringing a rational voice to the Veterans Affairs Committee from the Liberal Party, and I admire, and I say that sincerely because I know he's been productive. I keep very much in touch with my colleagues. The previous member from his party, not so much, but I welcome his interventions. Part of the challenge, Mr. Speaker, is transition itself for a veteran starts when they're a member of the Canadian Forces. So they're actually in D&D when they're going in Google and saying, do I move back to where I enrolled from, like Nova Scotia or BC, or do I stay where I'm finally posted to? So it actually has to be a case where D&D and VAC work better together. Each have chosen different models, and if that member pledges to break down some of those barriers between those two departments, I'll work with him on it, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Quebec-Mactaquac.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Durham for his thoughtful comments and also thank him for his service to our country. He did talk about some of the organizations that have been involved, and I did the Veterans Transition Advisory Council and the great work that they're doing, and CEOs and leading people in their organizations understand the benefits that these veterans can bring to their organizations. And he talked about the win-win. And the question I asked before was, seems to be two parts to this to me. The part is the service to the veterans when they come back and getting them ready, but then the second part of that is having a place for them to go. The private sector is stepping up in these fronts to do a number of this work, and it's good business for the public sector. So I just like his input as to the importance of attachment, because these folks are used to being on a team. They're used to working as a team. So it's as important to make sure they're back in the workforce to continue that team effort. And can you talk a little bit about the importance of that work environment to continuing that team effort?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Quebec-Mactaquac for the question. And in fact, he hit the nail on the head. In many ways, and I alluded to this in my remarks about the inherent loyalty that men and women of the Canadian Forces have, they want to join a new team in a lot of cases. Now, there are some programs out there. In fact, one of the Prince's Trust charities, Prince Charles Trust, actually works on entrepreneurship with veterans, and that was supported by the True Patriot Love Foundation. But the vast majority actually want to join a team, and we need to make sure that we connect them better to teams that want veterans on them. So that's why Treble Victor and some of these groups have been building networks within national companies, and including in Atlantic Canada, where companies like McCain's, like IMP Aerospace, and I met with them last week, Mr. Speaker, have a number of veterans already working within them. That actually helps a veteran transition in because they know someone has already blazed the trail. So we need to build better online resources to actually allow that mentoring to happen without the government needing to intervene. If there's a forum out there, and this is what Kevin Newman was calling for really in his blog, we need this to be facilitated by the veterans themselves. Another example of the government should get out of the way, Mr. Speaker, but he's very right. The team-based approach is key for many veterans.
Question et commentaire. Question et commentaire. Alors, la députée de Châteauguay à Saint-Constant.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie également mon honorable collègue pour son discours que j'ai bien apprécié, pour les efforts qu'il dit que le gouvernement met de l'avant pour aider les anciens combattants dans leur transition à la vie civile, parce que c'est effectivement un problème récurrent qu'on doit tenter de régler, et certainement que ça ne pourra pas nuire le projet de loi à cet effet. Il y a quelque chose que j'apprécie moi, par exemple, dans le discours de mon collègue, c'est un peu de propager la propagande gouvernementale. Il parle de 6 milliards de plus depuis 2006 qui a été injecté dans les programmes de transition depuis l'arrivée du gouvernement. Or, moi, j'ai fait le suivi un petit peu. C'est des montants qui ont été budgétés, mais qui n'ont pas été dépensés. Il y a presque 1 milliard là, qui n'a pas été dépensé dans les 7 dernières années et que le gouvernement continue de répéter. Donc, c'est quelque chose que j'aimerais soulever. Là, c'est pas tout à fait exact. D'un même montant aussi, ce qui a été budgété pour l'aide à la transition pour les études postsecondaires, universitaires, le gouvernement a annoncé une enveloppe de 2 millions, je crois, là, pour les 5 prochaines années. Si on divise par 100 000, là, ça va aider qu'une poignée d'anciens combattants à la transition ou à faire des études universitaires pour être employable dans la fonction publique. Qu'est-ce que mon collègue pense de cette enveloppe? Est-ce qu'elle aurait avantage à être augmentée pour aider davantage d'anciens combattants? Parce que c'est même pas 50 qu'on va aider sur 5 ans.
Alors, la secrétaire parlementaire du ministre du Commerce international.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member from Châteauguay for his question. And we served for a time on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I know he's sincere in his passion for veterans. One thing I'd invite him to learn more about is actually, as I said, the transition between Department of National Defense and veterans is key. A lot of veterans start when they decide they're transitioning at the end of their short service engagement or whatever contract they're under, they begin their education while they're in the Canadian Forces. So you can't actually look at just the post-release education without looking at the education gained in the Canadian Forces. It's also important to note, and this is where groups like Canada Company and others have actually worked on a lot of universities breaking down tuition barriers or reducing or eliminating tuition for some veterans depending on the nature of their release. So certainly education is a key part of transition, Mr. Speaker. The government is helping. Veterans are taking advantage of it. But it's also key to create this hiring culture and to show that government isn't the only answer, but we're part of the solution.